Cleveland, Ohio, August 1893. On a small plot of land leased from the steel mill, wedged between identical tar-papered shacks that bled smoke from tin chimneys, Laurent Szabó was building something that made no sense. He was not framing walls with milled lumber. He was not laying courses of brick. Instead, he spent the humid, coal-dusted days of late summer driving sharpened cane poles into the earth, weaving a great domed basket 16 feet across. His sons, Istvan and Zsófia, helped him soak long wicker withes in a trough of water, making them pliable enough to bend into the growing lattice. It looked like a giant, upside-down birdcage, a flimsy thing of sticks and reeds. His neighbors, mostly Irish and Polish steelworkers, watched from their stoops after a 12-hour shift, their faces grimed with soot. They saw a man building a joke. "What's that then, Szabó?" called O'Malley, a puddler from the rolling mill. "A basket to catch the rain?" Laurent just nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and continued his work. The mockery grew louder when the dirt began to arrive. He'd made a deal with a crew digging a new sewer main, trading his labor for cartloads of the dense, yellow-brown loess clay they excavated. He mixed it with water and a little straw, creating a thick, heavy mud. Then, with a wooden tamper his father had taught him to make, he began to pack the mud onto the wicker frame, layer by painstaking layer. This was the final proof for the community. The man was not just eccentric, he was mad. He was building a house of mud, a hovel fit for an animal. Howell Pemberton, the ward sanitation officer, made it a point to stop by on his rounds. He was a man who believed in right angles, milled lumber, and the cleansing power of whitewash applied over clapboard. He saw Szabó's creation as a direct affront to progress. "Mr. Szabó," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the weight of municipal authority, "this is a subgrade structure made of raw earth. It is a violation of the 1891 Sanitation Code, Section 4. It will breed damp, consumption, and vermin. You are building a tomb for your family." He made a neat entry in his ledger. "This is a foolish, backward thing to do in a modern American city." Laurent paused, his tamper held mid-swing. He looked at the sanitation officer, at the smirking men watching from the alley, and then at his growing dome of earth. "It is not a tomb," he said, his English thick but clear. "It is a memory." He turned and went back to his work, the rhythmic thud of the tamper echoing in the humid air. The men shook their heads. The Hungarian was crazy. What did this Hungarian Fuldas Epito, this builder of sunken earth dwellings from the great plain of Alfold, understand about pure thermal mass that a sanitation officer in the industrial heart of America had missed? What did he know about the memory of the earth that the builders of thin-walled shanties, shivering through every winter, had never even thought to ask? The story of Laurent Szabó's dirt dome is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a lesson in a forgotten branch of physics, a testament to the power of ancient knowledge in a world obsessed with the new. I'm going to tell you exactly how he built it, the precise scientific principles that made it work, and the dramatic moment of vindication that changed an entire community's understanding of what a home could be. I promise you we'll learn something fundamental about how the planet itself can heat a home. So subscribe to this channel, and if you've ever felt a draft in your own house, tell us in the comments what you think the most important part of a winter shelter is. Laurent Szabó was not a carpenter. He did not think in board feet or saw kerfs. He was not a mason, familiar with mortar and plumb lines. He was a man of the earth, a trade his family had practiced for centuries on the vast, flat expanse of the Hungarian Alfold. His tools were not saws and hammers, but clay spades, tamping mallets, and a deep, instinctual knowledge of the soil beneath his feet. He understood the character of loess, The fine, wind-blown silt that blanketed the plains, the way a shipwright understands the grain of oak. He knew how it held water, how it dried, how it breathed, and most importantly, how it held a grudge against the cold. In Hungary, he had built homes that were more landscape than architecture. They were low, rounded shapes that rose gently from the ground, their thick earthen walls keeping out the brutal summer heat and the equally brutal winter winds that swept unimpeded across the puszta. His was a knowledge passed down, not in books, but in the feel of the soil between his fingers, in the sound a wall made when it was properly compacted. Then, like so many others, the promise of America had called to him. The steel mills of Cleveland offered wages beyond imagination, a chance to build a new life for his wife, Ilona, and their children, Istvan and Zsófia. They arrived in 1892 and moved into a standard company rental, a hastily constructed shack on a muddy street where the air tasted of sulfur and iron. Their first winter in Cleveland was not a hardship. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a lesson in a new kind of cold. The cold of the Alfold was a dry, clean thing. The cold that blew off Lake Erie was a damp, predatory beast. It was a wet cold that seeped through the thin pine boards of their shack, a cold that had weight and texture. It was a physical presence in the room. Laurent burned through his wages buying coal, feeding the small pot-bellied stove until it glowed cherry red. Yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the stove's iron skin. The single-pane windows grew thick with frost that never melted. The walls were so cold that any moisture in the air instantly condensed and froze upon them, coating the cheap wallpaper in a delicate, glittering sheath of ice. Ilona's attempts to bring a bit of the old country with them failed in the face of this relentless chill. When she hung wet laundry near the stove, the rising steam would freeze on the rim of a nearby milk pan, growing a comical but terrifying frost mustache. The ribbons of licorice she'd bought for the children as a treat, stored in a glass jar on a shelf, cured in the frigid air until they became hard as wire. When Istvan tried to bend one, it snapped with a sharp crack. Even the simple act of washing clothes became a struggle against physics. The slivers of soap Ilona shaved into the washtub refused to dissolve, remaining as useless, inert grit in the icy water. They lived their lives in a constant, bone-deep shiver, wearing their coats and hats indoors, their breath pluming in the air of their own kitchen. Laurent watched his family suffer, and he knew the problem was not the stove, nor the coal. The problem was the house. It was a sieve for heat, a box designed for failure. The conventional wisdom in the Cleveland steelworker district was simple. If you were cold, you burned more fuel. The shacks, thrown up by the companies with little regard for longevity, were all built on the same flawed principle. They were thin skins of wood meant to keep out the rain and snow, but they offered no meaningful resistance to the cold itself. The problem wasn't just a lack of insulation, a concept still in its infancy. The problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat transfer. A typical worker's cabin had walls made of a single layer of 1-inch thick pine boards, often with gaps between them, covered by a layer of tar paper on the outside. The total R value, a measure of thermal resistance we use today, would have been less than 2. Pine is a relatively poor insulator, and its primary failure was through conduction. The molecular structure of the wood was a direct bridge for heat to travel from the warm interior to the freezing exterior. The pot-bellied stove might generate 30,000 BTUs of heat, but the walls were bleeding that energy out into the Ohio winter almost as fast as the fire could produce it. Convection was an even greater enemy. Cold, dense air is heavier than warm air. In the shacks, this created a constant, miserable cycle. Cold air poured in through dozens of unsealed gaps, around the windows, under the door, through the floorboards. This frigid air would sink to the floor, creating a permanent layer of cold that chilled the feet and ankles. The stove heated the air around it, which would rise to the ceiling. But as it circulated, it would come into contact with the ice-cold surfaces of the walls and windows, rapidly lose its heat, and sink back to the floor to be replaced by newly heated air from the stove. This convective loop was a brutally efficient engine for wasting heat. You could have your head in 70-degree air near the ceiling and your feet in 35-degree air on the floor. The neighbors suffered the consequences. The Jankowski family next door burned through 2 tons of coal before January and were reduced to burning scrap wood and even pieces of their own furniture. Their youngest child developed a persistent, rattling cough. O'Malley, the puddler, spent his nights in a constant battle, waking every 2 hours to stoke the fire, knowing that if it went out, the temperature inside would plummet to freezing within an hour. The thin walls offered no thermal storage, no buffer. The house was entirely dependent on a constant, active source of heat. When the fire died, the house died with it. Laurent saw this and recognized the pattern. These houses were fighting a war against winter they could never win. They were trying to defeat the cold with fleeting bursts of fire. He knew a different way. You didn't fight the cold. You simply made a space where it was not invited. In the late summer of 1893, Laurent Sabot began to build that space. The work was slow, methodical, and drew constant public scrutiny. He began by digging. Not deep, just a shallow, circular depression about 2 feet deep and 16 feet in diameter. This was the first offense in the eyes of his neighbors. A proper house had a foundation, it stood up from the mud, it asserted its presence. Sabot's house was nestling into the earth. Next came the skeleton. He drove dozens of 2-inch thick cane poles into the perimeter of the depression, angling them inward. Then, using the wicker withes his children had helped him prepare, he began to weave. He worked in a spiral pattern, starting from the ground and moving up, lashing the pliable wicker to the cane uprights. The structure that emerged was a beautiful, complex lattice, a perfect dome that looked both incredibly strong and impossibly light. It had the intricate organic geometry of a spider's web or a bird's nest. To his neighbors, it looked like a child's project, a piece of flimsy basketry that the first winter wind would tear apart. Then came the dirt. The loess clay he'd acquired was perfect for his purpose. It was a specific type of soil, composed of fine silt particles with just enough clay content to act as a binder. He mixed it with water in a shallow pit, adding chopped straw not for strength, but to help control cracking as the massive structure dried. He called this mixture valyog. The application was the most labor-intensive part. With Ilona's help, he hoisted buckets of the thick mud and began plastering it onto the outside of the wicker frame. He started at the base, building up a thick layer. Then he took up his tamper, a heavy block of oak with a long handle, and began to compact the earth. Thud, thud, thud. It was a slow, rhythmic, exhausting process. He would add a 6-inch layer of mud, then tamp it down to 4 inches of dense, solid earth. He was not merely piling up dirt. He was manufacturing a new material, a monolithic shell of calculated density. Day after day, the dome grew. The walls at the base were the thickest, reaching a final, compacted thickness of 7 feet. As the dome curved upward toward the crown, he gradually tapered the thickness to 5 feet. This was not an arbitrary dimension. He knew from centuries of experience that this was the required thickness to achieve thermal stability. He left openings for a single door and 2 small, deep-set windows. The final structure was a smooth, brown, monolithic mound, looking more like a feature of the landscape than a building. Inside, he coated the curved walls with a thick layer of whitewash, a mixture of slaked lime and water, which sealed the surface, brightened the interior, and had natural antimicrobial properties. He built up a floor of wooden planks resting on cribbing, creating a crawl space, a washan underneath that kept them off the bare earth. It was during this tamping phase that Howell Pemberton became a regular visitor. The sanitation officer could not comprehend what he was seeing. "Sabo," he declared one afternoon, gesturing with his clipboard, "the municipal code is clear. Habitations must be constructed of sound lumber, brick, or stone. There is no provision for a dwelling made of compacted mud. This structure will absorb ground moisture. It will be a breeding ground for mold and disease." Laurent paused in his work, leaning on his tamper. He pointed to the thick wall. "This is not mud," he said simply. "This is earth. It is dry." Pemberton scoffed. "It's wet right now because you're building it. Come the first thaw, it will be a swamp inside. I am lodging a formal complaint with the Ward Health Office. I'm warning you, the city will not permit your family to live in this thing." He was confident in his assessment, backed by the authority of modern science and civic regulation. He saw a primitive hovel. He did not see the elegant, massive thermal battery Laurent was carefully constructing. The secret of Laurent Sabo's dome was not insulation, it was thermal mass. These two concepts are often confused, but they are fundamentally different. Insulation is about resistance, slowing the passage of heat. A thin wall with good insulation, like the fiberglass bats we use today, works by trapping air and preventing heat from conducting through it. It's a barrier. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is about absorption and storage. A material with high thermal mass, like stone, concrete, or compacted earth, can absorb a huge amount of heat energy and release it very slowly. It's a reservoir. The thin wooden walls of the neighboring shacks had almost zero thermal mass. They couldn't store any heat, which is why they got cold the instant the fire went out. Laurent's dome was the complete opposite. It was almost pure thermal mass. Let's look at the numbers. The lowest clay he used has a density of about 110 pounds per cubic foot. The specific heat of this type of soil, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature, is about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. A single 1-foot wide vertical slice of his 7-foot thick wall, from floor to ceiling, contained roughly 50 cubic feet of compacted earth. This single slice weighed 5,500 pounds. To raise the temperature of that slice by just 1 degree Fahrenheit required over 1,200 BTUs of energy. The entire dome contained over 150 tons of compacted earth. Over the course of the long, warm summer and early autumn, this enormous mass of earth slowly absorbed heat from the sun and the air. The ground itself, below the frost line, maintains a stable temperature year-round, which in the Cleveland area is about 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Laurent's dome was, in effect, a massive, carefully shaped extension of the Earth's own thermal stability. By the time the first frosts of November arrived, the core of his 7-foot thick walls had reached a stable equilibrium of around 54 degrees. The dome had spent 4 months charging itself like a battery, soaking up the heat of August. The total stored thermal energy was colossal, measured in the millions of BTUs. When the brutal winter air descended, the house did not need to fight it. The outside few inches of the dome would, of course, get cold. But for that cold to penetrate all the way to the interior, it had to overcome the immense thermal inertia of 150 tons of earth. It was like trying to freeze a lake with an ice cube. The dome simply released its stored summer warmth at an incredibly slow, steady rate. The interior temperature naturally settled at the average temperature of the mass, around 54 degrees. It would take months of sustained Arctic-level cold to drain enough heat from the dome to significantly lower the interior temperature. The house was not being actively heated by a fire. It was passively coasting on the captured heat of a season that was long gone. Howell Pemberton saw a mud hut. The laws of physics saw a perfectly engineered heat capacitor. January of 1894 brought the true test. A polar vortex descended upon the Great Lakes, and for 14 consecutive days, the temperature in Cleveland did not rise above 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The real enemy, however, was the wind. A relentless 30-mile-per-hour gale blew from the north, straight off the frozen expanse of Lake Erie. It picked up moisture from the air and created a phenomenon known as freezing fog, a thick, icy mist that coated every surface with a growing layer of rime ice. The iron stair rails on the workers' shacks grew into gnarled, thick clubs of ice. Exposed metal became so cold it would instantly freeze any flesh that touched it. For the residents of the Steel District, it was a state of siege. The wind drove the cold through every crack in their flimsy homes. Families huddled around their stoves, which now ran day and night, consuming precious fuel at an alarming rate. The cold was so intense that water buckets left a few feet from a roaring fire would freeze solid. The sound of bursting water pipes echoed through the alleys. The Jankowski's baby was gravely ill, and the doctor couldn't reach them through the snowdrifts. O'Malley, desperate, had chopped up his kitchen chairs for firewood. His house was a tiny island of heat in an ocean of cold, and the tide was rising. Inside Laurent Szabo's dome, life continued with an almost surreal normality. There was no fire in the small stove. It had not been lit since a brief, chilly spell in November. The air inside was still and silent. The wind that howled outside was completely inaudible through 7 feet of solid earth. The interior temperature held steady at 54 degrees. It wasn't hot, but it was a comfortable, life-sustaining temperature. Ilona could cook on the stove without having to feed it constantly for warmth. The children, Istvan and Zsofia, could play on the plank floor in their sweaters, not bundled in layers of coats and blankets. The proof of this impossible stability sat on a small shelf built into the earthen wall. It was a bottle of Egri Bikaver, a robust red wine from Laurent's home region in Hungary. Each evening, Laurent would pour a small glass for himself and Ilona. The wine was the perfect cellar temperature. It poured clear and liquid, its dark red a splash of impossible life in the frozen world. He knew that in O'Malley's shack, the few bottles of beer he had stored in the shed had long since frozen, the expanding ice shattering their glass necks and pushing the caps out in a cascade of frozen foam. In here, the wine was safe. The dome was not just a shelter. It was a cellar, a pantry, a space that obeyed a different set of rules. It remembered summer. On the 10th day of the deep freeze near supper time, a bundled figure struggled through the drifts and banged on Laurent Szabo's door. It was Howell Pemberton, the sanitation officer. He held a clipboard to his chest, a document fluttering in the wind. He was there to serve the official eviction notice signed by the ward magistrate. The Szabo family was ordered to vacate the illegal dwelling before the start of Lent. Laurent opened the heavy wooden door. A swirl of freezing fog entered with Pemberton, who was covered in a fine layer of white ice. The officer's face was red and raw from the wind, his mustache stiff with frozen breath. He shoved the paper at Laurent. Official notice from the city of Cleveland. You are to vacate these premises. Laurent took the paper. Ilona stood behind him, her face anxious. It is supper, Laurent said, his voice calm. Please, come in while I read. He stepped back, holding the door open. Pemberton, expecting to enter a frigid, damp cave, hesitated for a moment and then stepped inside. The door closed, and the world went silent. The howling wind vanished. The first thing Pemberton noticed was the quality of the air. It wasn't warm, like the air from a stove, dry and scorching in one spot, frigid in another. It was a uniform, still, and neutral coolness. It was the air of a deep cellar in late spring. It was utterly, profoundly calm. He was massively overdressed. His heavy wool greatcoat, which had felt inadequate against the wind outside, was now suffocating. After a moment, beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. "I'll just wait here," he said, his voice tight. Ilona was at the stove, stirring a pot of goulash. The smell of paprika and beef filled the small, circular room. The children were sitting at the table, drawing on a slate. Pemberton stared. They were not wearing coats. "You have a fire," Pemberton stated, looking at the stove. "For cooking only," Laurent said. He gestured to the stovepipe. "Touch it." Pemberton, confused, pulled off a glove and tentatively reached for the metal stovepipe a foot above the stove. He expected it to be hot. It was cool to the touch. The realization began to dawn on him, but it was so contrary to every law of winter he had ever known that his mind struggled to accept it. There was no significant heat source in the room. Yet the cold was gone. Awkwardly, he unbuttoned and removed his greatcoat. Then he took off his hat. He stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, feeling the impossible air on his face. He walked to the wall and placed his bare palm against the whitewashed earth. He expected to feel the penetrating cold of a basement wall, a deep, damp chill. Instead, the wall felt neutral. It wasn't warm, but it radiated no cold. It felt solid, ancient, and deeply peaceful. He looked at the family, living a normal life in the heart of a polar vortex, and at the official eviction notice in his hand. The paper suddenly seemed like a ridiculous, meaningless artifact from another world, a world that didn't understand. He looked at Laurent. "How?" Laurent simply pointed up, at the thick curving dome above them. "The earth remembers the sun," he said. Pemberton stood there for a long moment. He looked at the eviction notice, with its official seals and bold proclamations of sanitation and order. He looked at the healthy, warm children. He felt the sweat trickling down his back. He had come as an agent of the city's law, an enforcer of modern progress. He had found something that defied his understanding, but was undeniably real and effective. He hadn't built a house of walls and timbers. The narrator thought to himself, "You didn't build a house, you built a season." Slowly, deliberately, Howell Pemberton took the eviction notice, tore it into 4 neat pieces, and dropped them onto the table. "My apologies for the intrusion, Mrs. Sabo," he said, his voice quiet. "Your supper smells delicious." He put on his hat and coat and left without another word, stepping back out into a world he now understood a little differently. The story of Howell Pemberton's visit spread almost as fast as the freezing fog. It started with the other ward officers, to whom Pemberton gave a terse official report. The Sabo dwelling meets an alternative standard of thermal efficiency. No violation, but the real story, the human story, spread through the community. O'Malley, hearing the tale, went to see for himself and returned a convert. The idea that a house could be warm without a fire was revolutionary. Laurent Sabo, who had never sought attention, found himself a reluctant teacher. Men would stop by after their shifts, not to mock, but to ask questions. He never preached or boasted. He simply explained, showing them the thickness of the walls, letting them feel the stillness of the air inside. For the large Hungarian community in Cleveland, Sabo's dome became a point of immense pride. He was one of their own who had used old country knowledge to solve a new world problem. The Cleveland Magyar Verhove Aid Association, a fraternal and benevolent society, took a formal interest. They invited Laurent to speak at their lodge hall. With his son Istvan helping to translate the more technical terms, he drew diagrams on a chalkboard, explaining the principles of the fold haz. The association's officers meticulously copied his drawings and descriptions. By the autumn of 1894, they had printed and circulated a small pamphlet detailing Sabo's method. It spread through their network of lodge halls to the Hungarian steelworker communities in Pittsburgh and South Bend, Indiana. The pamphlet wasn't a professional blueprint, but a set of principles. the wicker and cane lattice, the formula for the volyog, the critical 5 to 7 foot thickness, the orientation of the windows to catch the low winter sun. That fall, 11 families began construction on their own earthen homes. They were not all perfect copies. Some used scavenged brick for the foundation, others incorporated more lumber, but they all shared the core principle: a massive thermal battery of compacted earth. The era of the fire-dependent wooden shack was, for a small but significant group of innovators, beginning to end. They had learned a new way to survive. What Laurent Szabo built on that small plot in Cleveland was a precursor to some of the most advanced building science of the 21st century. His hand-tamped earth dome was, in essence, a high-mass passive house. Modern architects and engineers use concepts like thermal flywheel effect and phase change materials to describe the principles he knew instinctively. An earth-sheltered home, built into a hillside to take advantage of the ground's stable temperature, is a direct descendant of Szabo's Földház. We now have the language and the formulas to describe precisely what he accomplished. We can calculate the U factor of his walls, the seasonal heat flux, and the time lag of thermal transfer. His 5 to 7 foot thick walls would have a thermal lag of several months, meaning the peak heat of August would take until deep winter to work its way through the mass to the interior surface. He had created a structure perfectly synchronized with the seasonal rhythms of the planet. He had built a home that didn't just occupy a piece of land, but entered into a direct, symbiotic relationship with it. It stands as a powerful reminder that the most elegant engineering solutions are often the ones that work with nature rather than fighting against it. In the end, Laurent Szabo's genius was not in invention, but in memory. The American frontier and the industrial cities that grew from it was a place of forgetting. It demanded that immigrants shed their old ways, their old languages, their old knowledge, and adapt to the new. Build with milled 2x4s, because the sawmills are here. Burn coal because the mines are here. Forget the old ways of stone and earth and thatch. Szabo refused to forget. He carried within him a knowledge honed over 1,000 winters on the Hungarian plain. He looked at the problem of the Lake Erie cold and saw that the solution was not more fire, but a better memory. The other shacks were amnesiacs, their thin walls forgetting the sun's warmth the moment it was gone. They lived in a perpetual, desperate present, entirely dependent on the next shovelful of coal. Szabo's dome was different. It was a vessel for time. He didn't ask the cold to leave. He simply taught a dome of dirt to remember the heat of last August and lend some to the family in January. He built a bridge between the seasons, proving that the most profound shelter isn't a fortress against the elements, but a quiet conversation with them. It is a quiet lesson that what we need to survive is often already there, stored in the earth beneath our feet, waiting for us to remember how to ask. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of historical ingenuity. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom. And let us know in the comments, what modern building techniques do you think will seem foolish or outdated 100 years from now? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building practices and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. Any application of historical building techniques in a modern context should be undertaken with careful consideration of current building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.